When 73-year-old Margaret Chen walked into First National Bank on that crisp October morning, the teller assumed she was making her usual modest withdrawal for groceries. Instead, Margaret slid a handwritten note across the marble counter requesting her entire life savings, $847,000. The amount represented 47 years of careful budgeting, weekend shifts at the diner, and every birthday check from her grandchildren that she'd never spent. "Are you sure about this, Mrs. Chen?" the manager asked, his brow furrowed with concern. Margaret's weathered hands didn't shake as she signed the papers. She'd made her decision 3 weeks ago when she'd driven past the Hartwell Ranch for the 100th time, watching a man she'd never spoken to lose everything piece by piece. What happened next would divide their small town of Cedar Falls into two camps: those who thought Margaret Chen had lost her mind, and those who would witness something extraordinary unfold. The laughter started immediately. The tears would come later. This is the story of how one woman's impossible generosity changed not just two lives, but an entire community's understanding of what it means to truly help a neighbor. Margaret Chen had driven the same route to Mercy General Hospital every morning for the past 15 years. As head of housekeeping, she arrived before dawn and stayed until the last room sparkled. But, for the past month, she'd been taking a different path home, one that led her past the Hartwell Ranch on rural Route 47. She told herself it was because the fall colors were prettier along that stretch of road. The truth was harder to admit. Margaret couldn't stop thinking about the man she'd seen there 3 weeks ago, standing in his driveway with his head in his hands while a bank official posted foreclosure notices on his fence posts. Thomas Hartwell had never noticed the small Asian woman driving slowly past his property in her 15-year-old Honda. He was too busy trying to figure out how to tell his 8-year-old daughter that they might lose the ranch that had been in his family for 4 generations. His wife had died 2 years earlier from cancer, leaving him with medical bills that had already consumed their savings. Now the cattle prices had crashed, and he was 3 months behind on the mortgage. Margaret had grown up understanding loss. Her parents had immigrated from Taiwan with nothing but hope and a willingness to work 18-hour days. They'd saved every penny to buy a small restaurant, only to watch it fail during the recession of the early 80s. She'd watched her father cry exactly once, the day they locked the doors for the final time. That image had stayed with her for 40 years. The morning she made her decision, Margaret was wiping down the nurse's station on the pediatric ward when she overheard Dr. Rodriguez talking to another doctor about the Hartwell situation. The little girl, Emma, had been brought in the night before with a severe asthma attack. They'd had to call 3 different pharmacies to find one that would fill her prescription when Thomas's insurance card was declined. "Poor kid," Dr. Rodriguez said, shaking his head. "Father's doing everything he can, but sometimes everything isn't enough." Margaret finished her cleaning and walked to the break room, where she sat with her brown bag lunch and made a decision that would have shocked anyone who knew her. She was not an impulsive woman. She didn't make friends easily or trust quickly. She'd lived alone since her husband died 7 years ago and had never given more than $20 to charity at one time. But something about the image of that man standing helplessly in his driveway had broken something open in her chest. She understood what it felt like to watch everything slip away despite your best efforts. That afternoon, Margaret drove to the Cedar Falls Library and asked the librarian to help her use the computers. She spent 3 hours researching everything she could about ranch foreclosures, cattle farming, and the Hartwell family history. She learned that Thomas had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before coming home to help his ailing father run the ranch. She discovered that his wife, Sarah, had been a teacher at the elementary school and was beloved by everyone who knew her. She read about the medical bills and the drought that had decimated their hay crop the year before. The numbers were stark. Thomas owed $620,000 on the ranch, plus another $180,000 in various debts. The total was just under $800,000. Margaret stared at that figure for a long time, thinking about the savings account statement in her purse. She had exactly $847,000, accumulated over decades of living below her means. She'd always assumed she'd leave the money to her 2 grandchildren, who lived across the country and visited twice a year out of obligation. They were good kids, but they had their own lives and their own money. They didn't need her nest egg to survive. Thomas Hartwell, on the other hand, was about to lose everything. Margaret drove past the ranch again that evening. She could see lights on in the farmhouse kitchen and shadows moving behind the curtains. She imagined a father trying to explain to his daughter why they might have to move away from the only home she'd ever known. She thought about her own parents and how they'd never recovered from losing their restaurant. Her father had worked in other people's kitchens until the day he died, but he'd never been the same. She pulled over and sat in her car for 30 minutes, watching the house and thinking. A sensible person would drive home and forget about strangers' problems. A sensible person would protect their own future and let the chips fall where they may. Margaret had been sensible her entire life. It had kept her safe and comfortable, but it had also kept her isolated and cautious. At 73, she was beginning to understand that safety wasn't the most important thing in the world. The next morning, she called in sick for the first time in 5 years and drove to downtown Cedar Falls. Her first stop was the law office of Patricia Williams, the only attorney she knew by name. Patricia had handled Margaret's husband's will and had always seemed trustworthy. "I want to give away my savings," Margaret said without preamble when she sat down across from Patricia's desk. Patricia blinked. "Your savings? Margaret, are you feeling all right? Have you been under any stress lately?" "I'm fine," Margaret said firmly. "I've thought about this very carefully. I want to give my money to Thomas Hartwell to save his ranch." Patricia leaned forward. "Margaret, that's a very generous impulse, but we're talking about your life savings. What would you live on? What about your future care needs?" "I have my pension from the hospital and my Social Security," Margaret replied. "That's enough for my apartment and my expenses. I don't need $800,000 to buy groceries." "But what about emergencies? What about your grandchildren's inheritance?" Margaret had anticipated these questions. "My grandchildren are both college educated with good jobs. They don't need my money to be happy. As for emergencies, I've lived through plenty of them already. I'll figure it out like I always have." Patricia spent the next hour trying to talk Margaret out of her plan. She suggested smaller gifts, anonymous donations, setting up payment plans. But Margaret had done her research. Half measures wouldn't save the ranch. It needed to be all or nothing. "At least sleep on it for another week," Patricia urged. "A decision this big deserves more time." Margaret agreed to wait, but she'd already made up her mind. She spent that week watching Thomas from a distance, seeing him work from dawn to dusk trying to hold everything together. She saw him at the feed store, counting out crumpled bills to pay for supplies. She saw him at the gas station, putting exactly $10 worth of fuel in his truck. On Friday evening, she saw him sitting on his front porch with Emma, pointing out constellations in the clear October sky. The little girl was laughing at something her father said, and, for a moment, they looked like any normal family enjoying a peaceful evening together. That image settled it for Margaret. She'd grown up without siblings and had never had children of her own. She'd spent decades accumulating money she didn't need while families like the Hartwells struggled to survive. What was the point of security if it came at the cost of compassion? On Monday morning, Margaret walked into Patricia Williams' office with a manila folder full of bank statements and a typed letter outlining her intentions. "I want you to draw up the papers," she said. "All of it. Every penny." Patricia tried one last time to dissuade her. "Margaret, people are going to think you've lost your mind. They're going to say you're being taken advantage of, even though you've never even spoken to this man." "Let them think what they want," Margaret replied quietly. "I know what I'm doing." The legal process took 2 weeks. Margaret had to prove her mental competency with a psychological evaluation. She had to sign dozens of documents acknowledging that her gift was irrevocable and that she understood the financial implications. She had to sit through meetings with bank officials who questioned her decision and family members who called her after Patricia was required to notify them of the large financial transaction. Her grandson flew in from Seattle, convinced that someone was scamming his grandmother. He spent an entire afternoon trying to talk her out of her plan, growing increasingly frustrated with her calm refusal to explain herself beyond saying, "It's the right thing to do." "Grandma, you don't even know these people," he argued. "What if they waste the money? What if they're not who you think they are?" "Then, that's their choice to make," Margaret answered. "It won't be my money anymore." The paperwork was finalized on a Thursday. Margaret arranged for the funds to be transferred to an escrow account that would pay off all of Thomas Hartwell's debts and leave him with clear ownership of his ranch. The lawyer handling the foreclosure would receive the payment the following Monday morning, just 3 days before the sheriff's sale was scheduled to happen. Margaret insisted on complete anonymity. The Hartwells would know only that their debts had been paid by someone who wished to remain unknown. She didn't want gratitude or recognition. She wanted them to be able to rebuild their lives without feeling obligated to a stranger. On Friday afternoon, Margaret drove past the ranch one last time before the transfer would be complete. Thomas was in the front yard, teaching Emma how to throw a football. The foreclosure notices were still tacked to the fence, fluttering in the autumn wind. In 3 days, they would be removed, and the Hartwell family would discover that their prayers had been answered by someone they'd never met. Margaret pulled over and watched for a few minutes, feeling a strange lightness in her chest. For the first time in her adult life, she had no savings account, no financial security beyond her modest monthly income. Instead of fear, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of knowing she'd done something that mattered. She drove home to her small apartment, heated a can of soup for dinner, and went to bed knowing that her life savings had found a better purpose than collecting interest in a bank account. In 60 hours, Thomas Hartwell would receive a phone call that would change his family's entire future. Margaret had no idea that her anonymous gift would soon become the most talked about story in Cedar Falls history, or that her decision to remain hidden would prove to be impossible to maintain. Thomas Hartwell had stopped answering his phone. For 3 weeks, every call had brought more bad news: another vendor demanding payment, another extension denied, another deadline moved up. When his cell phone rang at 7:30 Monday morning while he was feeding the cattle, he almost didn't pick it up. "Mr. Hartwell? This is James Morrison from Morrison, Blake & Associates. I'm calling about your foreclosure case." Thomas leaned against the fence post, bracing himself for another blow. "Yeah, what is it now?" "Sir, I'm calling to inform you that your mortgage and all associated debts have been paid in full. The foreclosure has been canceled, and you have clear title to your property." The words didn't register at first. Thomas stared out at his pasture, watching his cattle graze in the morning mist. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "Your debts have been satisfied by a third party. All of them. The ranch is yours free and clear." "That's impossible," Thomas said, his voice hollow. "I owe almost $800,000. Who would pay that?" "The benefactor has requested to remain anonymous. I'm not at liberty to discuss the details, but I can assure you that the payments are legitimate and final." Thomas sat down heavily on an overturned bucket. His hands were shaking. "This doesn't make sense. People don't just give away that kind of money. What's the catch?" "There is no catch, Mr. Hartwell. The gift is unconditional. I'll be mailing you the paperwork today, including the deed to your property. You'll want to have your own attorney review everything, but I can confirm that you are no longer in debt." After Thomas hung up, he sat in his pasture for an hour, trying to process what had happened. He called the lawyer back twice to make sure he'd heard correctly. He drove to the bank to confirm that his mortgage had indeed been paid. By noon, he was convinced that he was either dreaming or losing his mind. Emma was at school, so Thomas had the rest of the day to grapple with his new reality alone. He walked through his house, really seeing it for the first time in months. Without the crushing weight of debt, everything looked different. The scuffed floors that had seemed like evidence of his failure now looked like signs of a well-lived-in home. The repairs he'd been putting off indefinitely suddenly seemed manageable. When Emma came home on the school bus that afternoon, Thomas was sitting on the porch steps with tears on his face. "Daddy, what's wrong?" she asked, dropping her backpack and running to him. "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart," he said, pulling her into a hug. "Everything's right. We get to stay home." That evening, Thomas called his sister in Denver and tried to explain what had happened. Like everyone else, she was skeptical and worried. Who gives away $800,000 to a stranger? What if it was some kind of money laundering scheme? What if whoever paid the debt would come back later demanding favors or threatening the family? Tommy, this doesn't happen in real life, she said. People don't just pay off other people's debts out of kindness. There has to be more to this story. But, as the days passed and no demands or explanations materialized, Thomas began to accept that someone had simply chosen to save his family for reasons he might never understand. The paperwork was legitimate. The title company confirmed that he owned the ranch outright. His attorney could find no liens, conditions, or future obligations attached to the gift. The story might have remained a private miracle if Thomas had been able to keep it to himself. But, when you're 3 days away from losing your family's ranch and, suddenly, find yourself debt-free, it's impossible to hide your relief. His neighbors noticed that the foreclosure signs had been removed. The feed store owner noticed that Thomas paid his bill in cash and bought extra supplies. Emma's teacher noticed that she seemed happier and mentioned that they wouldn't be moving after all. Within 2 weeks, half of Cedar Falls knew that someone had saved the Hartwell Ranch, and speculation about the mysterious benefactor was the hottest topic of conversation at every coffee shop and dinner table in town. The theories ranged from plausible to absurd. Some people thought it was a wealthy relative who'd been secretly keeping track of Thomas's situation. Others believed it was a government program or a charity that specialized in helping veterans. The more creative theorists suggested everything from lottery winnings that Thomas was hiding to a guilty corporate executive making amends for some past wrongdoing. Margaret heard the gossip at the hospital, where the nurses talked about little else during their lunch breaks. She listened to her co-workers debate the identity of Thomas's benefactor while she ate her sandwich in silence. The prevailing opinion was that whoever had done it was either incredibly generous or incredibly foolish. $800,000, said Janet from Pediatrics, shaking her head in amazement. Can you imagine just giving away that much money? I mean, it's wonderful for the Hartwell family, but what kind of person empties their savings account for strangers? Someone with more money than sense, replied Dr. Patterson. Or someone who's being scammed and doesn't realize it yet. Margaret found these conversations both amusing and frustrating. She'd expected people to be curious about the gift, but she hadn't anticipated the skepticism and judgment that came with it. Many of her co-workers seemed more interested in criticizing the unknown donor than celebrating the family that had been helped. The criticism intensified when word spread about the exact amount of the gift. $800,000 wasn't small change, even for wealthy families. It represented someone's life savings, someone's retirement security, someone's children's inheritance. The general consensus was that while the gesture was admirable in principle, it was financially irresponsible and potentially harmful to the donor's own family. Margaret's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, brought up the subject during one of their occasional hallway conversations. Can you believe this story about the ranch family? Whoever did that must not have been thinking clearly. I mean, what about their own future? What about their own emergencies? Margaret nodded politely and changed the subject, but the encounter left her feeling oddly defensive. She'd made her decision carefully and rationally. She didn't need financial advisors or neighbors or co-workers questioning her judgment, even if they didn't know she was the one they were criticizing. The pressure to reveal herself intensified when Thomas began trying to find his benefactor. He placed an ad in the Cedar Falls Gazette thanking the anonymous donor and asking for a chance to express his gratitude in person. He visited local churches, thinking someone might have organized a fundraising campaign. He even hired a private investigator to help track down the source of the payment. Margaret watched these efforts with a mixture of guilt and amusement. She could end Thomas's search with a single phone call, but she'd requested anonymity for good reasons. She didn't want to be thanked or celebrated. She didn't want to become involved in the Hartwell family's life going forward. She'd given them their freedom, she wanted to preserve her own privacy in return. But maintaining her anonymity became more difficult when Thomas's investigation led him to the hospital where Margaret worked. He'd learned that someone at Mercy General had been asking questions about his daughter Emma's recent emergency room visit, and he suspected that his benefactor might be connected to the hospital staff. Thomas spent an entire afternoon in the hospital lobby, hoping to spot someone who seemed familiar or who showed unusual interest in his presence. He introduced himself to nurses and doctors, hoping to trigger recognition from whoever had helped him. He even posted a thank you note on the break room bulletin board, asking his anonymous benefactor to come forward. Margaret saw the note when she arrived for her Thursday morning shift. Her hands trembled slightly as she read Thomas's carefully written message expressing his gratitude and his family's amazement at the stranger's kindness. He wrote about how the gift had saved not just their ranch, but their faith in humanity's capacity for unexpected generosity. That afternoon, Margaret made a decision that surprised her. Instead of driving straight home after work, she drove past the Hartwell Ranch one more time. She wanted to see the family now that they knew they were safe, now that the foreclosure notices were gone and their future was secure. What she saw stopped her heart. Thomas was in the front yard with Emma, and they were planting flowers along the fence line. Emma was laughing as she helped her father dig holes for small autumn mums. They looked like people who believed in their future again, people who thought it was worth investing in their home's beauty. Margaret pulled over and watched them work together in the golden afternoon light. This was what her money had bought, a father and daughter planting flowers because they knew they'd be there to see them bloom. She thought about her own garden, the small herb patch on her apartment balcony that she tended carefully despite its modest size. She understood the hope that came with planting something and trusting it to grow. As she sat in her car, Margaret realized that Thomas was walking toward the fence. He'd noticed her parked by the roadside and was approaching to see if she needed help. In 30 seconds, she'd be face to face with the man whose life she'd changed forever. Her first instinct was to drive away quickly before he reached her. But something made her stay. Maybe it was curiosity about what he was like up close. Maybe it was the desire to see his reaction when she told him the truth. Maybe it was simple loneliness, the recognition that she'd been watching this family from a distance for so long that she felt connected to their story. Thomas reached her car window just as Margaret was rolling it down. Up close, he looked younger than she'd expected, probably in his late 30s, with kind eyes and calloused hands. Emma was still in the garden, chattering to herself as she arranged the flowers. "Evening," Thomas said politely. "Everything okay out here? You look like you might be lost." Margaret stared at him for a moment, this stranger who had become so important to her. She thought about all the anonymous gifts and charitable donations made throughout history, all the lives changed by people who never revealed themselves. She thought about the satisfaction of helping without recognition and the loneliness of carrying such a significant secret alone. "I'm not lost," she said quietly. "I was just admiring your garden. You and your daughter are doing beautiful work." Thomas smiled, glancing back at Emma. "It's been a good day for planting. We've had some unexpected good fortune lately, so we're trying to make the place look nice again." The opening was perfect. Margaret could identify herself right now and end the mystery that had consumed the town for weeks. She could accept Thomas's gratitude and become part of the story instead of its hidden author. Instead, she smiled and said, "Well, you're very lucky. Not everyone gets second chances like that." "We sure are," Thomas agreed. "I keep wondering who would do something so generous for strangers. I'd like to thank them properly someday." Margaret felt her heart racing. Maybe they don't need to be thanked. Maybe knowing that you're happy is enough. Thomas considered this, studying Margaret's face with sudden intensity. There was something in her expression, something in the way she spoke about his situation, that made him pause. "Have we met before?" he asked. "You seem familiar somehow." Margaret's courage failed her. She shook her head quickly and started her engine. "I don't think so. I just heard about your story around town. I'm glad everything worked out for you and your daughter." She drove away before Thomas could respond, leaving him standing by the fence with a puzzled expression. Something about the encounter bothered him for the rest of the evening, though he couldn't identify exactly what it was. The woman had seemed genuinely interested in his family's welfare, but there was something more personal in her tone, something that suggested deeper knowledge of their situation than a casual observer would possess. Margaret returned to her apartment feeling shaken by the encounter. For a moment, she'd been tempted to reveal everything, to accept Thomas's gratitude and become part of his life going forward. But she'd maintained her anonymity for good reasons, and one conversation wasn't enough to change that decision. What she didn't realize was that their brief interaction had planted a seed of recognition in Thomas's mind. Over the next few days, he found himself thinking about the woman by the fence, trying to remember where he might have seen her before. He began paying attention to the hospital staff during Emma's follow-up appointments, studying faces and voices for any sign of familiarity. Margaret's secret was still safe, but the foundation of her anonymity had developed the first small crack. In a town the size of Cedar Falls, it would be impossible to remain invisible forever, especially when people were actively looking for her. The revelation came on a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 6 weeks after Thomas received the call that changed his life. Margaret was cleaning the pediatric ward when she heard a familiar voice at the nurse's station. Thomas was there with Emma for her routine asthma checkup, chatting with Dr. Rodriguez about the ranch and how well things were going. "The amazing thing is that we still don't know who helped us," Thomas was saying. "I've talked to everyone I can think of, followed every lead, but our benefactor seems determined to stay hidden." Margaret tried to continue her work, but she found herself moving closer to eavesdrop on the conversation. "Maybe that's for the best," Dr. Rodriguez replied. "Some people prefer to help without recognition. There's something pure about that kind of giving." "I understand that," Thomas said, "but I keep feeling like I met them recently. There was this woman by our fence a few weeks ago, and something about her seemed familiar. She knew things about our situation that seemed too specific for casual gossip." Margaret's heart stopped. She was wiping the same windowsill for the third time, her movements automatic while her mind raced. Emma, who had been quietly coloring in a chair nearby, looked up suddenly. "Daddy, was she the Asian lady with the gray hair? I saw her car there lots of times before we found out about the money." Thomas turned to his daughter with surprise. "You saw her before? When?" "On my way home from school. Her car was always parked by the fence, just sitting there. I wondered what she was looking at." Margaret's hands were trembling now. She needed to leave the area immediately, but moving would draw attention to herself. She stayed frozen by the window, hoping desperately that the conversation would move away from her. Dr. Rodriguez was looking thoughtful. "Asian woman with gray hair? That sounds like it could be Margaret Chun from housekeeping. She's worked here for 15 years, very quiet, keeps to herself." "Margaret Chen," Thomas repeated slowly. "Where would I find her?" Margaret knew she had seconds to make a decision. She could slip away quietly and hope Thomas never connected the dots, or she could turn around and face the consequences of her generosity. Her entire body was telling her to run, but something deeper kept her feet planted where they stood. "She's probably working somewhere on this floor right now," Dr. Rodriguez said. "Margaret's always here early. Let me see if I can find her for you." This was it. In 30 seconds, Dr. Rodriguez would locate her and bring her over to meet Thomas face to face. All of Margaret's careful anonymity would disappear in an instant. She thought about her peaceful apartment, her quiet routine, her life without complications or obligations to strangers. Then, she thought about Emma planting flowers with her father, about Thomas teaching his daughter to throw a football without the weight of foreclosure pressing down on them. She thought about the sleepless nights she'd saved them and the second chance her money had provided. Margaret turned around. "You don't need to find me," she said quietly, walking toward the nurse's station. "I'm right here." Thomas stared at her for a moment, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition to complete shock. "You," he said. "You're the woman from the fence." "Yes," Margaret replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm Margaret Chun." Emma looked back and forth between the adults, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. Dr. Rodriguez was watching the interaction with growing awareness. "Margaret," Thomas said slowly, "did you pay off my ranch?" The words hung in the air between them. Margaret could still lie, could claim coincidence or deny everything. Instead, she nodded once. Yes, I did. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas sat down heavily in the nearest chair, running his hands through his hair. Emma was staring at Margaret with wide eyes, beginning to understand that this quiet woman had somehow saved their home. But, why? Thomas asked finally. You don't even know us. Margaret had rehearsed this conversation in her mind dozens of times, but, now that it was happening, her prepared explanations seemed inadequate. How could she explain that watching his family struggle had broken something open in her heart? How could she describe the way her parents' failure had haunted her for decades, making her desperate to prevent another family from experiencing the same loss? I know what it's like to lose everything, she said simply. I couldn't let it happen to your family if I had the power to stop it. $800,000, Thomas whispered. That's your life savings, isn't it? Margaret nodded again. It was. Margaret, what have you done? Dr. Rodriguez interjected, his voice filled with concern. That money was your security, your future care fund. How will you manage when you retire? I'm 73, Margaret replied. I've been managing fine for decades. I'll continue managing fine. Thomas was shaking his head in amazement. I can't accept this. It's too much. No one should give away their entire life savings for strangers. You already accepted it, Margaret pointed out. The money's gone, the ranch is yours. Whether you feel guilty about it now doesn't change anything. Emma had been listening to this conversation with the serious expression children wear when they're trying to understand adult problems. Suddenly, she slipped out of her chair and walked over to Margaret. Thank you, she said gravely, looking up at Margaret with Thomas's kind eyes. Thank you for letting us keep our home. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. In all her imagined scenarios about being discovered, she'd never considered having to face Emma directly. The little girl's simple gratitude was more overwhelming than any adult reaction could have been. You're welcome, sweetheart, Margaret managed. Thomas was struggling with emotions he couldn't quite name. Gratitude was obvious, but it was mixed with embarrassment, confusion, and a kind of awe that made him feel small and humble. He'd been raised to believe that people should stand on their own 2 feet, that accepting charity was shameful, that independence was the highest virtue. But, looking at Margaret Chan, this slight woman who'd given away everything she had for his family's welfare, he realized that his assumptions about charity and independence might be too simple. There was nothing shameful about her gift or his need for it. There was only one human being helping another human being in the most direct way possible. I don't know how to thank you, he said eventually. You don't need to thank me, Margaret replied. You need to take good care of that ranch and raise your daughter to be kind to people who need help. But, Margaret, Dr. Rodriguez interrupted, what about your own future? What happens if you get sick? What happens when you can't work anymore? The same thing that happens to millions of other people without savings, Margaret said matter-of-factly. I'll figure it out day by day. That's not a plan, Thomas protested. That's not security. Margaret smiled for the first time since the conversation began. Security is an illusion anyway. I thought I was being prudent, saving all that money for emergencies and old age. But, what's the point of security if you're too afraid to use it for something important? This is important to you? Thomas asked. More important than anything I would have spent the money on otherwise. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of 2 nurses who'd heard about the encounter through the hospital's efficient gossip network. Within minutes, word was spreading throughout Mercy General that Margaret Chen, the quiet woman from housekeeping, was the mysterious benefactor who'd saved the Hartwell Ranch. By the end of her shift, Margaret had been approached by dozens of co-workers wanting to hear the story firsthand. Some were amazed by her generosity. Others questioned her judgment. A few accused her of being foolish or mentally unstable. The attention was everything Margaret had hoped to avoid by remaining anonymous. The story reached the local newspaper by evening. The Cedar Falls Gazette ran a front-page article the next day with the headline "Local Woman Gives Life Savings to Save Family Ranch." The article included photos of both Margaret and the Hartwell family, along with interviews about the unprecedented act of generosity. The reaction was swift and divided. Letters to the editor poured in from readers who either praised Margaret as a saint or criticized her as a fool. Some called her gift an inspiration that restored their faith in humanity. Others worried that her example would encourage other people to make financially irresponsible decisions. Margaret tried to ignore the attention and return to her normal routine, but anonymity was no longer possible. Strangers recognized her at the grocery store and wanted to discuss her decision. Reporters called her apartment asking for interviews. The hospital administration scheduled a meeting to discuss her newfound fame and its impact on the workplace. Thomas was dealing with his own version of unwanted attention. People who'd previously offered only sympathy now wanted to debate whether he should have accepted Margaret's gift. Some praised him for graciously receiving help when he needed it. Others criticized him for not finding a way to return the money or at least ensure Margaret's financial security. The pressure became overwhelming 3 days after the newspaper article was published. Thomas drove to Margaret's apartment building that evening and knocked on her door. "We need to talk," he said when she answered. Margaret invited him in and made tea while Thomas sat uncomfortably on her small sofa. Her apartment was modest but comfortable, with plants in every window and photographs of her late husband on the end tables. It was clearly the home of someone who lives simply by choice, not necessity. "Margaret, I can't live with this," Thomas said without preamble. "You gave me everything you had, and now people are calling you foolish and irresponsible. I can't be the reason you're being criticized." "You're not the reason," Margaret replied calmly. "I'm the reason. I made the choice. But I could give the ranch back to the bank and return the money to you." Margaret set down her teacup and looked at Thomas directly. "Do you want to give the ranch back?" "No," he admitted. "God help me, no. Emma and I love that place more than anything in the world." "Then, don't give it back." "The money is gone, Thomas. It was gone the minute I decided to give it away. Whether you feel guilty about it doesn't change the fact that it was mine to give and I chose to give it to you." "But your security," "My security was never threatened by poverty," Margaret interrupted. "It was threatened by meaninglessness. I had $800,000 that was doing nothing except earning interest. Now that money is keeping a family together and maintaining a ranch that's been in your family for 4 generations. Which use seems more meaningful to you?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "The whole town thinks you're either a saint or crazy." "The whole town is wrong," Margaret said. "I'm neither. I'm just a woman who had more money than she needed and found a better use for it." "What happens now?" Thomas asked. "Now you go home to your daughter and your ranch. You take care of both of them. You work hard and build a good life and remember that sometimes people help each other for no other reason than because they can." "And you?" Margaret smiled. "I go back to work tomorrow morning, and I clean the hospital rooms, and I go home to my apartment in the evening. The same life I've always had, except now I know I did something that mattered." Thomas left Margaret's apartment that evening with a new understanding of generosity and sacrifice. The criticism and questions would continue for weeks, but he no longer felt ashamed of accepting Margaret's gift. Instead, he felt obligated to prove that her faith in his family had been justified. Over the following months, Margaret's story spread beyond Cedar Falls. National news outlets picked up the story of the hospital housekeeper who gave away her life savings to save a stranger's ranch. Margaret declined all interview requests and continued working at Mercy General until her planned retirement 6 months later. The attention eventually died down, but the impact of Margaret's gift continued to ripple through the community. Thomas not only saved the ranch but expanded it, eventually hiring 3 local workers and partnering with neighboring farms to create a cooperative that helped other struggling ranchers stay afloat. Emma grew up understanding that her childhood home had been saved by a stranger's kindness, and she carried that lesson into adulthood. She became a teacher like her mother had been, and she made a point of helping students whose families were struggling financially. Margaret lived comfortably on her pension and Social Security. just as she'd predicted. She never regretted her decision, though she did sometimes wonder what would have happened if Thomas had never discovered her identity. She suspected she would have enjoyed keeping the secret forever, but she also appreciated the friendship that developed between her family and his after the truth came out. 5 years later, when Margaret needed minor surgery and had no family nearby to help with her recovery, Thomas and Emma insisted she stay with them at the ranch until she was back on her feet. Margaret protested that it wasn't necessary, but she secretly enjoyed being fussed over by people who genuinely cared about her welfare. Sitting on the ranch's front porch during her recovery, watching Emma practice riding horses in the same pasture where Margaret had first seen Thomas facing foreclosure, Margaret felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing your life has made a difference. Her $800,000 hadn't bought her security or comfort or prestige. It had bought something much more valuable, the knowledge that when someone needed help, she'd been brave enough to provide it. The story of Margaret Chan and the Hartwell Ranch became legend in Cedar Falls, told and retold with increasing embellishment over the years. But, for Margaret herself, it was simply the day she'd stopped watching from the sidelines and decided to participate in someone else's happiness. It wasn't a grand gesture or a saintly act. It was just one person helping another person in the most direct way she could imagine. And, in a world full of complicated problems and inadequate solutions, sometimes the simple act of sharing what you have with someone who needs it is the most radical thing you can do.